It started with a phone call I didn't see coming. I had just settled into my chair, coffee steaming beside me, the kind of quiet you don't hear in cities anymore. Then my phone buzzed. My son-in-law, Ethan, was on the line. His voice had that tone again, sharp, businesslike, like he was giving orders at work. "Dad, my parents are moving in with you. The place in the woods has plenty of room. If you don't like it, come back to the city." Just like that. No question, no discussion. Just a statement, as if my home was a timeshare he could assign. I remember staring at the mug in my hand, watching the steam fade and thinking, 40 years of saving, building, planning, and now I'm told who gets to live in my own house. But I didn't argue. I didn't yell or hang up. Instead, something inside me went very still. For most of my life, I'd been the calm one, the guy who kept peace at the dinner table, who worked overtime instead of fighting. But that day, something shifted. I decided silence would be my weapon and patience would be my plan. Ethan didn't know it yet, but he'd just started a game I was finally ready to play. A few weeks before that call, I'd done something I'd dreamed about for decades. After 40 years in construction engineering, deadlines, traffic, stress, noise, I took my savings and bought a little cabin in the Wyoming woods. Nothing fancy, just 800 square feet of cedar stone and stillness. When I first arrived, the air smelled like pine and wet soil. A herd of elk grazed beyond the clearing, their breath visible in the cool morning air. The cabin looked just like the photos, aged wood-green metal roof, a small porch facing the mountains. Inside, I unpacked like a man who finally had time. Each tool went on the pegboard in order. Books lined the shelf by subject history mechanics, a few novels I'd never had time to read. The coffee pot sat exactly where the morning sun would hit it. Everything about that space felt intentional, calm, earned. For the first time in my adult life, I woke up with no alarms, no meetings, no one knocking on my door, asking for help. I'd tell myself, "This is it, Walter. You made it. You're free." I would sit outside every evening, rocking gently as the forest turned gold. The elk would come and go. The wind would hum through the trees. Sometimes I'd think, maybe this is what heaven feels like. And then that phone call came, the one that cracked the peace I'd built with my own hands. I had thought I'd finally bought silence. Turns out I'd just rented it until someone decided to take it away. That night, after Ethan's call, I didn't sleep much. I sat at the small kitchen table staring at the grain of the wood, the smell of pine still fresh in the air. The peace I'd dreamed of had turned into a puzzle that needed solving. Luckily, solving problems was what I did best. I pulled out an old engineering notebook, the same kind I'd carried on job sites for 40 years. Each page was printed with grid lines, perfect for sketches and calculations. I drew a simple box for the cabin, marked directions for wind, sun, and elevation, then started listing everything I could control: time, tools, terrain, and most importantly, my patience. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning defense. There's a difference. When you work in construction, you learn that good structures aren't built on emotion. They're built on precision. A single weak point, a loose joint, a wrong angle can bring down the whole thing. Family drama is no different. You can't shout your way to safety. You build it brick by brick, decision by decision. The next morning, I drove down to the ranger station near the edge of Yellowstone. The man behind the counter looked like he'd spent half his life in the sun. We talked for a while about wildlife in the area, wolves, bears, elk migration routes. I took careful notes like a student again. He told me wolves could smell food from miles away, that they were cautious but curious. That part stuck with me. Cautious but curious. It sounded a lot like me. Before I left, he handed me a pamphlet about safe storage and said, almost as a joke, "Don't leave anything outside you wouldn't want a bear to find." I nodded, thanked him, and tucked the note into my folder. Back in town, I stopped by an outdoor supply shop, the kind that sells everything from snow boots to rifles. I told the clerk I wanted cameras for monitoring wildlife around my property. He showed me 2 trail cameras, motion-activated night vision strong signal. I tested the image feed right there in the store, making sure they worked. I wasn't taking chances. That's something people forget about getting older. We may move slower, but we've had a lifetime to learn the power of preparation. That evening I installed the cameras. One faced the gravel driveway. The other watched the tree line behind the cabin. I tested the angles, checked the light, repositioned until each view felt right. Then I connected both to my phone, 1 bar of service barely holding, but enough. It might seem paranoid to some, but to me it was simple logic. You don't wait for problems to knock. You reinforce the door. When I finished, I stood on the porch looking out at the valley below. The sun dipped behind the mountains, painting everything in soft gold. My hands were steady again. My plan was forming, measured, quiet, controlled. I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready. Sometimes protecting your peace means acting before anyone else realizes you're at war. The plan wasn't about danger. It was about teaching a lesson and letting nature play its role. A few days after setting up the cameras, I drove into town and stopped by a small butcher shop that served the local ranchers. The air inside smelled like smoke and salt. I asked for about 20 pounds of beef scraps, the kind they usually throw away or sell cheap for dogs. The butcher didn't even blink. Out here, people don't ask why. They just weigh the meat and wrap it in brown paper. Back at the cabin, the air had that late afternoon chill you only get in the mountains. I opened the cooler and looked at the meat, raw, heavy, pungent. I wasn't planning to harm anyone. I just needed to remind certain people that this cabin was built in the wilderness, not suburbia. The wind was steady from the west that day, so I walked 30 yards upwind deep into the clearing. I split the meat into a few piles, spacing them far enough from the cabin, but close enough to draw attention. Wolves travel by scent, not by sight. They don't need an invitation, just a signal carried by air. I remember standing there for a long moment, listening. The forest was so quiet, I could hear my own breathing. Somewhere beyond the trees, a hawk cried. It felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then I went back inside. I locked the windows, double-checked the doors, unplugged everything that didn't need power, and lowered the thermostat. Old habit, protect the structure before you leave. My truck was already packed. Before I closed the door, I looked around one last time. That cabin had only been mine for a few days, but I'd built it up in my mind for 40 years. Now it looked different, less like a dream, more like a test. I drove back to Denver that night. The road wound down the mountain in long curves, headlights catching snow still clinging to the pines. It was nearly midnight when I reached the edge of the city. My old house felt too bright, too empty, but I had everything I needed, my laptop, my phone, and the live feed from those 2 cameras miles away in the woods. I set the laptop on the table, opened the connection, and watched. The cameras showed nothing but dark stillness at first, trees shifting in the wind, a raccoon passing by. Hours went by. I made coffee I didn't need. Then I waited some more. People think patience is about doing nothing. It's not. Patience is quiet readiness. It's the moment before a storm when you know something's coming, but you don't rush it. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused, calm, deliberate. The stage was set. The forest would speak next. 2 mornings later, my phone buzzed while I was fixing breakfast in Denver. I didn't need to look at the number to know it was Ethan. There was tension even in the ringtone, short, sharp, impatient. I clicked accept and didn't say a word. His voice came through the speaker already raised. "What did you do, Walter? My parents could have been killed." I set my coffee down and opened my laptop. The live feed was still running. On the screen, I saw exactly what had happened. Hours earlier, a gray sedan pulling up the dirt road, 2 people stepping out, Leonard and Grace, Ethan's parents. They looked around, annoyed by the dust, the cold, the distance. You could tell they weren't country people. Grace wrinkled her nose as if fresh pine air was offensive, then, almost as if the forest had been waiting for them. Movement appeared at the edge of the clearing. 3 wolves leaned quiet and curious. They weren't charging. They were simply investigating, drawn by the scent I'd left days before. Leonard froze. Grace gasped, clutched his arm. You could see their instinct kick in, city instincts that never learned what silence means in the wild. They panicked. Leonard shouted. Grace stumbled, and they bolted back to the car. Gravel spun under the tires as they sped down the mountain road. The wolves just turned away, uninterested, once the humans were gone. Back on the phone, Ethan kept shouting, "You set this up. You wanted to scare them. You baited those animals." I let him finish. Then, in the calmest tone I could manage, I said, "Ethan, your parents came to a wilderness cabin. Wolves live there. It's their home, not ours." He started to argue again, but I cut him off. "You can't demand peace and ignore the price of it. Out there, nature makes the rules, not you, not me." There was silence on the line, an angry kind of silence, the kind where you can almost hear someone grinding their teeth. Then he muttered something under his breath and hung up. I stared at the still image on my screen, the clearing empty now, the sunlight sliding between the trees. For a long moment I just listened to the quiet hum of my old refrigerator and thought about how fragile control really is. People think fear comes from danger, but it doesn't. It comes from misunderstanding. Leonard and Grace didn't face real harm that day. They faced their own assumptions that the world bends to comfort, that the woods are a backyard, not a frontier. I leaned back and took a slow sip of coffee. The lesson wasn't for the wolves. It was for the people who thought they could walk into my life and rearrange it. Living out there had taught me something simple. If you want peace, you have to respect the wild. Otherwise, the wild will remind you who it belongs to. A few days after the chaos with the wolves, I decided it was time to set things straight face to face. I've learned over the years that silence can protect you for only so long. Sooner or later, you have to put your boundaries in writing. So I called Leonard and Grace, the parents of my dear son-in-law Ethan, and suggested we meet in town. I picked a small cafe on Main Street in Cody, the kind of place where the smell of roasted beans greets you before the door even shuts. It wasn't fancy, but it was neutral ground. I got there 15 minutes early, ordered black coffee, and chose a seat near the window where I could see the door. Old habit. I like to know what's coming before it walks in. They arrived right on time, both dressed like they were headed to church. Not a conversation about accountability. Grace's smile was tight. Leonard's expression already disapproving. They sat across from me without ordering anything. Leonard was the first to speak. "Let's make this quick, Walter." We came to collect the keys. I slid a folder across the table. Inside was a short-term rental agreement I'd typed and printed the night before. It wasn't meant to insult them, just to set clear terms. Fair rent, 6-month period, standard clauses. I'd even included a discount. "This is what I'm offering," I said, keeping my tone calm. "If you'd like to stay at the cabin, you'll pay rent like anyone else. It covers utilities, maintenance, and peace of mind for all of us." Grace blinked, confused, then let out a sharp laugh. "You're charging family to live in your house?" Leonard leaned forward, his face reddening. "Unbelievable. We come to you out of need, and this is what we get. You're greedy, Walter, just plain greedy." People in the cafe started glancing over. I didn't raise my voice. I just gathered my folder, tucked the contract back inside, and stood up. Years on construction sites taught me that shouting never strengthens a structure, it only weakens it. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said simply. "But boundaries aren't greed, they're respect." As I passed the counter, I nodded to the barista and left a tip in the jar, one last act of courtesy before stepping outside. The morning air was cold but clear, the kind that wakes you up better than any caffeine. Behind me I could still hear their voices, low and angry, but I didn't turn back. I'd spent a lifetime trying to make everyone comfortable, even at my own expense. Not anymore. I wasn't going to argue my right to peace. Out here I'd learned that words can twist, but paper doesn't lie. So I let the contract and the silence speak for me. It started quietly, the way most betrayals do, not with shouting or slammed doors, but with whispers, small, calculated, and well-placed. At first I didn't notice. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years called out of nowhere, asking if I was doing okay out there alone. Then an old coworker from Denver reached out, saying Ethan had mentioned I'd been acting strange lately. The words came sugar-coated, wrapped in concern, but the pattern was obvious. Ethan was planting seeds. He wasn't coming after my house with a crowbar. He was coming with paperwork. I'd seen this kind of tactic before back in construction management, when someone wanted control but didn't have the right. They'd start a rumor, question your judgment, and let the system finish the job for them. It was slow, silent, and effective. That's what Ethan was doing now, building a case that I was losing my mind. He told people I was paranoid, that I'd set wolf traps out of delusion, that I'd stopped answering calls because I didn't trust anyone. In reality, I was busy documenting everything, keeping records, building proof. But to anyone listening from afar, the story he spun sounded more dramatic and more believable. The goal was simple: make me seem incompetent enough for a court to step in assigned guardianship and let him manage my assets. It's called conservatorship, a legal tool meant to protect the elderly, but in the wrong hands it becomes a weapon. I realized then that my real fight wasn't against family intrusion, it was against the quiet erasure of my independence. When you're young, people steal your time. When you're old, they steal your rights. And they often do it with a smile. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, coffee cooling beside a stack of notes and documents. Every rumor he spread only confirmed one thing: I needed to be smarter, faster, and calmer than he was. Ethan wanted to make me look unstable. My best defense would be evidence, cold, organized, undeniable. He was playing a social game. I was building a legal fortress. They say family should be your safety net, but sometimes they're the ones testing how big the holes are. So I decided to stop reacting and start preparing. If they wanted a war, they'd get one, but not the kind they expected. This wouldn't be fought with shouting matches or emotional pleas. It would be fought with signatures, records, and logic. They were trying to trap me with stories. I would answer with facts. After weeks of half-truths and family gossip spreading like smoke, I realized I couldn't fight this alone. Rumors are like wildfire. They burn fastest when you try to explain yourself. What I needed wasn't another argument. I needed protection that could stand in court. So one cool Thursday morning, I drove to Cody, Wyoming, a town big enough to have lawyers but small enough that everyone still waves when they pass. The drive itself was quiet, all pine shadows and open road. I had plenty of time to think, and the more I did, the clearer it became. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. It was about defense. David Holt's office sat above an old hardware store on Sheridan Avenue, the kind of place where the paint on the doorframe still carried the smell of history. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who looked like he'd once worked a ranch before law school found him. When I stepped in, he offered me a handshake that felt steady, no rush, no judgment. I told him everything, from Ethan's first call to the wolves to the fake concern calls from family. He listened without interrupting, just nodding and taking notes on a yellow pad. When I finished, he leaned back, crossed his arms, and said something that landed like a hammer on steel. "Mr. Green, they're not trying to take your house, they're trying to take your competence." That's the moment I understood the scale of it. He explained how easy it is for someone to file a petition claiming an elderly relative can't manage their own affairs. Once that happens, the courts can freeze your assets, assign a conservator, and leave you powerless over your own life, all in the name of protection. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that says he's seen this before and knows exactly where to strike back. But you can stop them before they even start. He introduced me to the concept of a revocable living trust, a legal wall built to keep unwanted hands off what's yours. It meant my property would no longer be owned in my name, but held within a trust that I controlled while I was alive. No one, not Ethan, not the court, not even well-meaning relatives could touch it without my consent. It was the kind of protection that doesn't need confrontation. It just works quietly in the background, unshakable and precise. I told him to start immediately. As we went over documents and fees, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: clarity, maybe even peace. Because power doesn't always come from fighting harder. Sometimes it comes from being one step ahead. When I left his office, the late afternoon light hit the mountains in the distance, and for the first time since this all began, I felt like I had something stronger than anger. I had a plan built on paper signatures and law, the same kind of foundation that even family drama couldn't crack. Money has a way of revealing people. You can hide behind words, behind manners, even behind family ties. But numbers, they always tell the truth. A few weeks after meeting with Attorney Holt, I started digging through some old paperwork Ethan had asked me to co-sign years earlier. At the time, I didn't think much of it, just a favor to help him refinance some home expenses. Back then, my daughter Emily trusted him completely, and for her sake, so did I. But now things didn't feel right. Holt had warned me that whenever families start circling around an inheritance, you need to follow the paper trail. So I did. I requested a few records, made some calls, and pulled public filings from the county clerk's office. What I found hit me like a cold wind. Ethan's parents, Leonard and Grace, had been losing big money at the casino just outside Billings. $47,000 in losses within 6 months. Multiple cash advances, some even taken out against retirement accounts. They weren't looking for a place to live. They were looking for a place to hide from debt collectors. Then came Ethan's part. He had quietly opened a home equity line of credit, $35,000, against the house he and Emily shared without ever telling her. The loan was still active, with minimum payments barely keeping it afloat. The statements listed transfers that didn't match anything Emily would have approved. That's when it clicked. Their sudden interest in my cabin, the push for control, the talk of family guardianship. It wasn't about care or concern. It was about collateral. They weren't trying to protect me. They were trying to leverage me. For years, I'd believed in fixing problems with conversation. This time I saw the truth for what it was. They were treating me like a line of credit, not a person. I printed every document, labeled every page, and put it all in a fireproof binder. Facts, not feelings. That's how you survive a quiet war like this. It's strange how betrayal always circles back to money. It doesn't start with greed. It starts with fear, fear of losing comfort, image, or control. But fear doesn't excuse manipulation. Looking at those statements, I felt no anger anymore, only clarity. For the first time in months, the picture was complete. They had built their trap with lies and debt. I was building my defense with evidence and truth. And in a fight like that, the truth always has better odds. Some moments in life don't make a sound when they happen, but you can feel them shift the ground under your feet. For me, that moment came in the form of a stack of papers on Attorney Holt's desk, plain, quiet, and more powerful than any argument I could ever make. After weeks of collecting proof-tracing debts and watching my own family twist the story, I knew what needed to be done. Holt slid the final draft of the revocable living trust toward me. He spoke plainly, as if explaining a tool rather than a weapon. Once this is signed, Walter, everything you own moves here. The cabin, your savings, even the land title. It's still yours, but no one can touch it without your consent. I read every word slowly. Each line felt like a wall going up between me and the chaos that had been circling my life. The key clause sat in the middle of the document, simple but firm. My daughter Emily would inherit everything only if she was no longer married to Ethan Carter. It wasn't revenge, it was clarity. I wanted her to be protected, not trapped by someone else's mistakes. I added one final note beneath my signature written in my own hand. I am fully of sound mind and acting of my own free will. That single sentence was my shield against the lies Ethan had been spreading. He could whisper all he wanted about my supposed confusion, but the ink on that paper said otherwise. When I signed it, Holt stamped it and said softly, "Congratulations, Mr. Green. You just built yourself a fortress." It wasn't about greed or control. It was about peace. Every person who's ever worked hard for something understands that peace has to be protected, not assumed. As I left his office, the wind outside had picked up, carrying that dry Wyoming scent of dust and cedar. I thought about how fragile ownership really is, how easily your life's work can be rewritten by someone else if you don't put it in writing yourself. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The trust wasn't just a legal move, it was a promise to myself. I had spent a lifetime building, fixing, and giving. Now for once I was keeping something safe. Paper doesn't look like much, but when it's written with purpose, it can hold more power than any threat, any rumor, any family name. It happened late on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that looks peaceful from the outside but carries a storm underneath. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, turning the sky that deep copper color only Wyoming seems to know. I was sitting on the porch reading through a few documents when I heard tires crunching hard on the gravel. A silver truck came flying up the driveway, dust trailing like smoke. Before I even saw his face, I knew who it was. Ethan. He slammed the door so hard the echo bounced off the trees. He walked fast, almost stomping, his voice already raised before he reached the steps. The words came out like bullets, accusations, curses, and half-truths twisted into something ugly. He shouted about betrayal, about how I had turned Emily against him, about how he knew I was hiding something. I stayed seated for a moment, not to look brave, but to stay grounded. When someone's yelling that loud, they want control. Silence steals it back. Then I took out my phone, pressed record, and set it on the arm of my chair. Ethan didn't notice at first. He was pacing now, pointing his finger, getting closer with every sentence. His face was red, his words slurred with anger. "You think you can just cut me out? I'll have this whole place under my name before you're even gone." I stood up slowly. Not in challenge, but in warning. The space between us shrank to only a few feet. I looked him straight in the eye and said quietly, "Ethan, I'm not your problem, but you're about to become your own." He froze for half a second, and that's when his eyes caught the phone screen, still glowing, still recording. The moment shifted. He tried to laugh it off, mumbling something about just talking, but it was too late. The truth was already caught his tone, his threats, his rage. When he finally drove away, the gravel sprayed like shrapnel. The whole valley went silent again, as if the forest itself had exhaled. I picked up the phone, checked the video, and saved it twice, once on the device, once in the cloud. Then I opened my laptop, wrote a short summary of what had happened, and attached both the clip and the written statement in an email to Attorney Holt. It wasn't about revenge. It was about record-keeping. That's something people underestimate. A calm mind and a timestamp can be more powerful than any argument. You don't win these battles by shouting louder. You win by documenting what others try to hide. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because the fight was over, but because I finally had proof of who the real aggressor was. Sometimes justice doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from having the right evidence when the storm finally clears. It was a quiet morning, the kind that smelled like coffee and pine needles. I was in my workshop sorting through a set of old wrenches when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel again. Only this time it wasn't Ethan's truck. A gray sedan stopped at the end of my driveway, and a woman stepped out, carrying a clipboard and a tablet. She walked with that practiced calm that only government workers have. "Mr. Green," she asked. "I'm Margaret Willis with Adult Protective Services. We received a report concerning your welfare." There it was, the next move in Ethan's campaign. He hadn't managed to take my property, so now he was trying to take my credibility. I could have been angry, but anger gives people power. So I smiled politely and opened the door wide. "Come on in," I said. "Coffee?" She declined, of course. Professionals always do. Then she started her inspection. She glanced around the cabin, clean counters, stacked bills, stocked fridge, fresh fruit on the table. Everything in its place. My years in engineering had taught me to treat every detail like evidence, and that habit was paying off now. When she asked if I had trouble managing finances or remembering bills, I slid a folder across the table. Inside were bank statements, tax receipts, and expense ledgers, each labeled dated and cross-referenced. Then I handed her the results of my full medical and psychological evaluation from the previous week. The letter from Dr. Chen was short and clear. Patient is mentally competent, physically healthy, and fully capable of managing his affairs. Margaret read it slowly, then looked up at me. "This is unusually thorough, Mr. Green." I smiled. When you've been an engineer for 40 years, you learn to anticipate problems before they happen. She walked through the rest of the cabin, snapping photos for her report. No safety hazards, no neglect, no confusion. Just a man who'd worked hard for his peace and wasn't about to lose it to lies. When she finished, I escorted her to the porch. "Can I ask," I said, "was it my son-in-law who filed the complaint?" She hesitated. "I can't legally confirm that," she replied, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the county office. The investigation was officially closed. The report's conclusion read like a small victory. Allegations unsubstantiated. No evidence of cognitive decline or neglect. Complaint appears to be motivated by a family property dispute. I placed the letter in a new folder labeled False Allegations, Closed Case, and filed it on my shelf beside the others. Most people think battles like this are fought in courtrooms. They're not. They're fought in kitchens with paperwork patience and the kind of quiet composure that confuses those who expect you to crumble. Ethan thought he could discredit me. Instead, he gave me another layer of proof evidence that would later make his downfall complete. In the end, the truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits there, stamped, signed, and filed neatly under your own name. It was one of those late summer afternoons when the air feels thick and still, like the world is holding its breath. I'd just finished repairing a loose board on the porch when Attorney Holt called. His voice was calm but carried an edge that made me straighten up. "Walter," he said, "I think you need to check your mailbox. Something doesn't add up." At first I didn't understand, but when a lawyer tells you that something about your address doesn't add up, you listen. The drive down my long dirt road took less than 5 minutes, but it felt longer. Dust followed behind me like a ghost. The metal mailbox stood in the same spot it always had, weathered and plain. Yet when I opened it, the first thing I saw made my stomach tighten. 3 envelopes sat inside, all addressed, not to me, but to Leonard and Grace Carter, Ethan's parents. Each bore an official seal, one from the Wyoming Department of Family Services, another from a local credit union, and the last from the Social Security Administration. They were using my cabin's address. My address. I pulled on a pair of gloves before touching anything, an old habit from years of engineering safety protocols, and photographed each envelope front and back. Every postmark, every date, every return label. Then I sealed them in a clear evidence bag and drove straight home. When I called Holt back and told him what I'd found, he didn't hesitate. "That's federal mail and benefits fraud," he said. "They've been pretending to live there to collect aid or open accounts. We'll escalate this immediately." By the next morning, the evidence had been sent to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The investigator assigned to the case called me personally, a man named James Morrison from the Economic Crimes Division. He'd seen plenty of family disputes before, but even he sounded surprised. "Mr. Green," he said, "you have clear proof they've been using your property as a false residence. That's a serious federal offense. All I could say was I never gave them permission. I have video footage showing they were only at my cabin once." He paused for a moment, then said, "That's more than enough. We'll handle it from here." I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a while, looking at the forest line outside my window. I thought about how greed drives people to invent new kinds of dishonesty. They had faked an address to commit fraud, and they'd chosen mine, thinking I'd be too old, too naive, too tired to notice. But they'd underestimated the one thing I'd spent my entire life mastering: documentation. In engineering, one wrong number can bring down a bridge. In law, one wrong detail can collapse a lie. That week, Holt and I worked side by side to prepare a formal package: photos, dates, recordings, even my sworn statement. Within days, the case shifted from family drama to federal crime. And just like that, the playing field changed. This was no longer about emotions or inheritance or manipulation. This was about justice. When I mailed that last envelope of evidence, I took one long look at the forest road leading back to my cabin. For months, it had been the setting of deceit. Now it was the path toward something stronger: accountability. Sometimes truth doesn't roar in. It arrives in the quiet shuffle of paperwork, the steady click of a camera, or the sound of a single mailbox door closing. There's a certain kind of silence that comes before you make a decision that changes everything. It isn't peaceful. It's heavy, deliberate. That was the silence in my cabin. The morning I learned my daughter Emily's home was about to be foreclosed. Attorney Holt called just after sunrise. His voice was calm, but his words weren't. Walter, the Carters are 3 payments behind on their mortgage. The bank has already filed a notice of default. I remember staring at my coffee as the steam faded. Emily's house, the one she'd painted herself, the one where she'd planted lilacs in the backyard because her mother loved the smell. She had no idea what was coming. And I knew Ethan wasn't going to tell her, not until it was too late. For a moment I felt that old ache in my chest. A mix of love, disappointment, and something sharper, resolve. Holt went on. There is one unconventional option. You could buy the debt. The bank is likely to sell it at a discount to a collection firm. We could intercept it through an LLC, keep your name off the paperwork. You'd become the creditor. Ethan would never know. I didn't answer right away. The idea was simple, but the weight of it wasn't. It meant taking control of their debt, of my daughter's future without her knowledge. But it also meant saving her from the wreckage Ethan had created. That night I walked the edge of my property, listening to the wind in the pines. The cabin lights glowed behind me, warm and steady, while everything ahead was uncertain. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel right, it feels lonely. The next morning I told Holt, do it, but keep it quiet. A week later, Pine Ridge LLC was born. Nothing fancy, just a name and a purpose. Using that company, I wired $31,000 to purchase Emily's delinquent mortgage from the bank. The transfer went through cleanly, the title updated. And just like that, I held full control of the debt. On paper, it was business. In truth, it was protection. When the confirmation arrived, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the document. It felt surreal. My own daughter's home, once a symbol of independence, now tethered to me through a hidden line of credit. But I didn't feel like a master of anything. I felt like a father doing what fathers do, stepping in quietly when everyone else walks away. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ethan had spent months trying to gain power over my property, and now the roles had reversed. Without even knowing it, he was living in a house whose fate rested in the hands of the man he tried to destroy. I filed the paperwork under a new folder labeled leverage. The word didn't mean control, it meant balance. Because this wasn't revenge. It was preparation. A last line of defense before the final chapter. Some people fight back with anger. Others fight with silence. But I've learned the strongest fight of all is the one that happens behind closed doors, in ink and signatures, with the patience of someone who refuses to lose what matters most. And now, for the first time, the board was mine. When Emily pulled up the long dirt road to my cabin that Saturday, I could see the worry written all over her face. She stepped out of her car with cautious eyes, clutching her jacket, even though the air was warm. I'd made lunch her favorite chicken salad sandwiches, but I knew food would be the last thing on her mind. We sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight pouring in through the window. Between us lay a thick folder, the story she didn't yet know she was living in. At first she tried to smile. "Dad, what's going on?" "Your message scared me." I took a deep breath. "Honey, there are things you need to see. Things Ethan hasn't told you." I opened the folder and began one page at a time: bank statements, legal filings, mortgage records, loan agreements. Her hands trembled as she read. With each document, the illusion unraveled. The missed payments, the secret home equity loan, the gambling debts that started it all. When she reached the letter from Adult Protective Services, the false report her husband and his parents had filed to have me declared incompetent, she went completely silent. Then the tears came hard and heavy. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, letting her cry. Sometimes silence is the only thing strong enough to hold truth. After a long while, she whispered, "How long have you known?" "Since spring," I said quietly. "But if I'd told you without proof, you would have thought I was just angry. I needed you to see it with your own eyes." She nodded slowly. Her face was pale, but clear. That's the moment she began to let go, not just of Ethan, but of the lies that had held her. The following week, she filed for divorce. Ethan tried to fight at first, demanding half the assets. But when he learned that I now owned his mortgage through Pine Ridge LLC, the battle ended quickly. Holt drafted the agreement. I would forgive the entire debt if Ethan signed away all rights to Emily's property and made no future claims. Within 72 hours, every signature was in place. The Carters, his parents, weren't as lucky. The federal fraud case moved fast. They pleaded guilty and were sentenced to probation and heavy restitution. For the first time, the noise stopped. By early autumn, Emily found a small house 15 minutes from mine. We painted the walls together the same soft blue her mother once loved. I helped her hang curtains, fix a broken window latch, and plant a few lilacs near the porch. She laughed when I showed her how to patch drywall, said she never thought she'd learn that from me. We started having Sunday dinners again, simple meals, long conversations. Sometimes we'd just sit outside watching the elk wander through the clearing like they used to. One evening, as the sun melted into the mountains, she said softly, "You didn't just save me, Dad. You gave me my life back." I shook my head. "No, honey. I just helped you see what was already true." Later that night, after she drove home, I stayed on the porch a while longer. The air was cool, the forest calm. A small herd of elk appeared again at the tree line, the same way they had on my first night here. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the creak of the wood and the whisper of the wind. For the first time, in a long time, I felt still. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. There were no victories, only lessons about love boundaries and the quiet strength it takes to protect both. As the last bit of light slipped behind the ridge, I said to myself almost in a whisper, I didn't beat anyone. I just kept what was mine, my peace, my life, my daughter. And for me, that was enough.